Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by LaShaw to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
Welcome in, everyone. Today we're diving into a study on sex toy use, specifically among transgender and non-binary individuals in Italy. It's pretty fascinating stuff. You ready to get into it?
Absolutely. You know, it's the first study of its kind that zeroes in on this specific community. And it's really refreshing because it approaches the whole topic with such a sex-positive lens, focusing on pleasure and well-being.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I gotta say, some of this stuff was really eye-opening.
Yeah. You know, we don't often see research that focuses specifically on this population, so it's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So to kind of kick things off, I think the first thing that really jumped out at me was just how common sex toy use was within this group. 88% of the participants reported using them, and 77% had used them in the past 6 months.
Right, that's a huge majority.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's also interesting to look at the types of toys that were popular.
Absolutely. The study found that external and internal vibrators were the most common, along with strap-ons.
But what I found really interesting was how this study dug into the motivations behind those choices. It wasn't just about pleasure, although, of course, that played a role.
There were definitely some deeper reasons that came up.
Yeah. What were some of the other things that they highlighted?
The study found that sex toys could actually provide a way for folks to explore intimacy without necessarily involving the body parts that might cause discomfort or dysphoria.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just for a listener who might not be familiar with that term, dysphoria refers to the distress that a person experiences when their gender identity doesn't align with their physical sex characteristics.
Right, exactly. Some of the participants shared how sex toys actually help them affirm their gender identity. There was even one participant who put it this way. They said, "When I'm with a partner, it is only through the use of toys that I can experience pleasure and alleviate the discomfort caused by genital dysphoria, which prevents direct touch."
Wow. That's such a powerful statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just highlights the really profound impact that these tools can have on a person's sense of self and well-being. And the study also found that a lot of people were using sex toys with partners.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just a solo thing.
No, not at all. 81% of the participants said they use sex toys with partners.
Wow. The study also touched on how participants described using sex toys to overcome inhibitions.
Yeah.
And feel more comfortable exploring their desires and fantasies.
Yeah.
It seemed like there was a sense of liberation tied to that.
Absolutely. I think for people who might have faced a lot of stigma or internalized shame around their sexuality, sex toys can create a safe and private space to experiment and embrace those desires without feeling judged.
And that's something we all deserve.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the positive aspects, but I know the study also brought up some of the challenges that participants faced. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. One of the biggest issues that came up was the difficulty of finding sex toys that were actually designed for their needs.
Like, what were some of the specific concerns?
Well, a lot of participants felt that existing options didn't really cater to their bodies, especially when it came to non-conforming bodies.
Right, so they were feeling excluded.
Yeah, and some even said that it made them feel dysphoric.
Which makes sense. If you can't find something that fits your body, it can really mess with your sense of self.
Absolutely. And it really speaks to the limitations of the current market.
Yeah, and the influence of cisnormativity in product design.
Right, like the assumption that everyone's body fits into these neat little categories.
When in reality, there's so much diversity.
Exactly, and that's something the industry really needs to address.
What were some of the other challenges that came up?
Well, cost and accessibility were also big concerns, especially for people who are importing products from abroad.
Right, that makes sense. Those costs can really add up.
Yeah, and it can create a real barrier for people who are on a limited budget.
It's like sexual well-being shouldn't be a luxury.
Exactly. Everyone should have access to the tools they need to explore their sexuality,
regardless of their financial situation. And I think it also speaks to a larger issue, which is the lack of readily available and affordable sexual health resources for marginalized communities in general.
Absolutely. It's a systemic problem that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we move on, I wanted to touch on one more thing that I found really interesting in the study.
Okay.
They found that there were also a lot of commonalities in sex toy use between trans and non-binary individuals, and the general population.
Yeah, that's right. They found that participants were also using these tools to explore things like pleasure preferences, sensations, and fantasies.
Right, which are all aspects of sexuality that are universal.
Exactly, regardless of gender identity.
It's a good reminder that while there are definitely unique challenges and considerations for the trans and non-binary community, the desire for sexual exploration and fulfillment is something we all share.
Absolutely. It really reinforces the human element of sexuality.
And it helps to break down those barriers that we sometimes put up between different identity groups.
Right, because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to figure out what feels good.
And find ways to connect with ourselves and others. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah, we have.
This study really gives us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. It's a really valuable contribution to the field.
Yeah, and I think it's a call to action for all of us.
In what way?
To really think about how we can create a more inclusive and equitable world when it comes to sexual well-being.
Right, like we need to move beyond just acknowledging the problem
Yeah.
and actually start taking steps to address it. Okay, so what are some of your ideas?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to make sure that everyone has access to accurate information about sexual health.
Right, and that includes information about sex toys.
Yeah, because there's still a lot of stigma and misinformation out there.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to start having more open and honest conversations about these topics.
Yeah, like in schools and in families and in a healthcare setting.
Exactly, because the more we talk about these things, the less taboo they become.
Right, and that can create a safer and more supportive environment for everyone.
Okay, so beyond education, what else can we do?
Well, I think we also need to address the issue of cost and accessibility. Like, we need to find ways to make these products more affordable for people.
Yeah, maybe through subsidies or sliding scale pricing.
Right, or even just by making them more widely available in stores.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into sex toy use among trans and non-binary folks in Italy, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I think this research really sheds light on an important aspect of sexual well-being. You know, it gives us some really valuable insights into how trans and non-binary people are using sex toys and how it ties into their identities and experiences.
It definitely makes you rethink some of those common assumptions we have about who uses sex toys and why.
Right.
And I think, like you were saying earlier, there's a huge need for more inclusivity in this market.
Yeah, absolutely. The industry needs to step up and start creating products and marketing that actually reflects the needs of the trans and non-binary community.
And it's not just about the industry doing their part. It's about creating a culture where we can talk about sex and pleasure openly and honestly. So I guess the takeaway here is that we all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive and affirming environment when it comes to sex and pleasure.
I agree, and that can look like a lot of different things. Supporting businesses that are doing things right, educating ourselves and others, and just being more mindful of the language we use.
Every little bit helps.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it for today. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It was a really thought-provoking conversation, and we hope you learned something new.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by LaShaw. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SOUNDRAW.